What's a story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. My friend once told me about something that happened to her when she was about 8 or 9 years old. She was walking home from school and got her key out to unlock the door to her house. Her single mother, who worked during the day, usually came home later on weekdays. As my friend reached up to insert the key into the lock, the door suddenly opened. Her mother, wearing a dressing gown and looking unwell, stood there. She had stayed homesick that day. Instead of greeting her daughter, her mother immediately looked past her and asked, "Who are you?" Startled, my friend turned around and saw a man in a long coat hurriedly walking back down the path and disappearing down the street. Her mother's unexpected illness and presence at home that day might have saved her daughter from something truly terrible. Story 2. A few years ago, I worked as a vet tech, and one day a man came in with his elderly dog to have it put to sleep. We followed the standard euthanasia protocol, gathering a basic history, asking if the owner wanted to be present, and so on. When one of my coworkers asked if he wanted to be there during the procedure, the man replied, "Yes, because I lost both of my boys last week, and I wasn't there for them. I'll be damned if I'm not here to say goodbye to my last living family member." We later learned that his sons had died overseas. After hearing his story, our entire staff went into the euthanasia room and hugged him and his dog for several minutes, even after his dog had peacefully passed. In all my years in the field, I've never encountered someone as heartbroken as this man saying goodbye to his beloved pet. Story 3. When I was about 17, I went out back to take out the trash and heard a strange noise in the backyard that spooked me. I ran back inside and everyone laughed at me until my mom said she thought she heard something in the basement. Suddenly, we all felt uneasy because we knew the outside door to the basement was open. My mom, who usually says if people are overreacting, decided to call the cops because she was so certain of the noise she'd heard. About an hour and a half later, it was around 2 a.m. by then, the cops still hadn't arrived, and we'd kind of moved on since we hadn't heard anything else. We were sitting on the front porch, off to the side and out of the light, when a car slowly came down the block. The driver turned off the headlights 2 houses down and stopped just past our driveway. We froze, afraid to move, as the driver got out, retrieved something from the trunk, and walked off down the block. At that point, we decided we'd had enough of the creepy night and went back inside, locking the doors behind us. As soon as we got inside, the car left. About an hour later, an officer finally showed up. We told them everything, saying we probably just heard raccoons in the backyard, but we were now more concerned about the strange car. The officer left, and we eventually went to bed. The rest of the night was quiet. The next evening, around 11 or 12, my mom burst into my room, saying there were a bunch of emergency vehicles outside. We all went outside, and of course, all we could talk about was what had happened the night before. After a few minutes, my mom walked over to the news crews to find out what was going on. It turned out that our neighbor had been attacked. A man broke into their home, shot the husband, and robbed the wife. Story 4. My grandfather's second wife was a sleepwalker, the kind who would get up in the middle of the night and do things like make a sandwich in the kitchen. My grandfather got used to it, and whenever he woke up to find her missing from bed, he'd gently lead her back without waking her, just as he'd been advised. One night he woke up and noticed she wasn't lying beside him. Instead, she was sitting on the edge of the bed with her back turned to him. He called her name to ask what was wrong, but she didn't respond, and he realized she must be asleep. He could tell she was doing something with her hands, holding something in her lap, but he couldn't see what it was. Sitting up, he leaned over her shoulder to get a closer look. That's when he saw what she was doing. Still asleep, loading his revolver. Story 5. When I was about 4 and my sister was nearly 1, my parents had been divorced for a few months. My mother decided to drive us from Las Vegas to Wichita to visit our grandparents. During one stop at a gas station, a man approached our car and said to my mother, "I hate to see a single mother traveling alone. I noticed we're heading in the same direction. Would you like me to follow you for a while to make sure you're safe?" She politely declined, saying, "No thanks," and we drove off. At the next gas station stop, the same man appeared again, this time claiming he was just checking on us. It turned out he had been following us since the last stop. As he spoke to my mother, the wind blew his sport coat open, and I saw a gun tucked into his pants. After my mom once again said we were fine and drove off, I told her what I had seen. While driving, my mom wrote a note detailing who we were, where we planned to spend the night, and a description of the creepy man following us. She asked the next gas station attendant to contact the police in the town where we'd be staying and let them know the situation. When we arrived at the next gas station, my mom quickly handed the clerk the note and drove off in a hurry. At the hotel, the manager had police officers waiting in one room and gave us another room with pizza and soda. Later that night, the man showed up and asked the manager if his wife and kids had checked in and which room they were in. The manager handed him the key to the room with the police. The officers questioned him and discovered he was a convicted rapist with a warrant out for his arrest. He was taken into custody, and thanks to my mom's quick thinking, we were safe. Story 6. When Chinese basketball star Yao Ming walked through the national stadium during the opening ceremony of the Olympics, all eyes were on him. But few people paid attention to the little boy walking beside him. That boy was Lin Hao, a 9-year-old survivor of the devastating Sichuan earthquake in May. The international press reported Lin as an earthquake survivor, but what many missed was the full extent of his bravery. Lin, who attended Uzixi Primary School in Wenchuan County, near the quake's epicenter, not only survived but went back into the rubble after escaping to save 2 of his classmates. During the rescue, Lin was struck by falling debris, suffering injuries to his head and arms. Despite his pain, he encouraged the remaining 10 survivors from his class of 32 to sing songs together to keep their spirits up while they waited for help. When asked why he risked his life to save others, Lin replied, "I was the hall monitor. It was my job to look after my classmates." His courage and selflessness were a moving tribute to the resilience of those affected by the earthquake and a moment of pride for the nation during the Olympic ceremony. Story 7. When I was in elementary school, a student at my school was involved in a horrific tragedy, a triple homicide suicide. His father killed his mother, his brother, and then him before taking his own life. According to the news, it happened in the middle of the night while they were sleeping, but I couldn't stop imagining what it must have been like to be in that house during those moments. After the first murder, everyone in the house would have woken up. The thought of being surrounded by the people you've loved and trusted your whole life, only to witness them being taken away one by someone you looked up to, is terrifying. The child was only 10 or 11. It was incredibly sad. What made it even worse was that in high school, a similar incident happened in my city. It wasn't someone from my school this time, but the house where it happened was less than a mile from where I lived. These kinds of events are so unsettling, especially when they happen so close to home. Story 8. 2 years ago, I was in a car wreck that nearly killed me. It happened late at night as I was driving home. I fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into a tree on the driver's side. I don't remember anything from the accident or the days immediately following, but I woke up in the ICU, strapped to a bed with a respirator and a feeding tube. My injuries were severe. I had broken bones in my skull and collarbone. Both of my lungs had collapsed, and my diaphragm was ruptured. Every doctor I've seen since has told me it's a miracle I survived. The most chilling part of the story is how I was found. A couple who lived in my neighborhood had just dropped their daughter off at a bus headed to camp, where she was working as a counselor. The bus had been delayed by an hour and a half because a few other counselors were late. One of them was my best friend from elementary school. On their way home, the couple noticed a car parked on the wrong side of the road. It was dark, and they couldn't see any damage at first, so they kept driving. But then the wife thought she heard honking and convinced her husband to turn around. When they found me, I was unconscious. My car was completely dead, and the horn wasn't even functional. It was later confirmed to have been broken. They didn't know it was me until 2 days later. Their actions that night saved my life. If that bus hadn't been delayed, or if they hadn't decided to turn around, I wouldn't be here today. Story 9. When I was a Boy Scout, I earned the Filmmaking Merit Badge one winter camp. Part of the requirement was to create a short film, no matter how bad it turned out. Since we were in the woods, my group decided to make a slasher movie. The plot wasn't groundbreaking, a masked killer going around stabbing people at a Boy Scout camp, but we thought it would be fun. There was a kid named Paul in our group who was super likable and got along with everyone. We unanimously voted for him to play the killer because he had this creepy Peter Lorre eye thing going on. He did a great job fake stabbing everyone and being menacing for a movie made by 12 and 13-year-olds. We finished editing it, complete with buckets of fake blood and terrible acting, and I forgot about it for years. Fast forward 6 years. I was a freshman in college when I ran into Paul on campus. We hadn't kept in touch, but we made small talk about spring break plans and went our separate ways. A week later, I was back home watching the news when I saw a story about a young man who had killed his parents, 2 family dogs, and set their house on fire over spring break. The suspect's photo appeared on the screen, And it was Paul. You can probably guess how he did it. He stabbed them to death. Storytime. When I was 16 or 17, my friends and I often went camping in the mountains. We'd bring weed, beer, and sometimes acid. But I was always too scared to do much, probably because I took my parents' warnings to heart. That night, most of my friends were tripping on acid while I was sipping a beer, enjoying the fire. A group of us girls decided to head into the woods to pee, still too squeamish about the boys seeing us. One girl, who was really high, kept searching for the perfect spot, so we wandered deeper into the woods. Eventually, we reached a small clearing and decided to pee there. Afterward, as we were heading back to camp, one of the girls heard a low moan coming from the other side of the clearing. She told us to be quiet and listen, but we didn't hear it and urged her to come back with us. She insisted on investigating, so I went with her. We moved cautiously, our lantern's light barely reaching into the darkness. Suddenly, the light illuminated a car, a brand new looking Subaru. The sight of it startled us, and we ran back to the group screaming. When we told the boys, they teased us, saying we'd stumbled on another campsite, and we eventually laughed it off. 5 years later, I was in nursing school, working as an admin assistant in a labor and delivery hospital. One of my coworkers and I became close friends, and one night, she told me about her father. He'd been missing since she was in high school. He had a history of suicide attempts, and her family assumed he had succeeded, though no body was ever found. She confided that she secretly hoped he had just run away to start a new life. Not long after, a man was discovered in a stolen Subaru up in the mountains where we used to camp. He had been there for years through every season and had taken his life with a hose running from the tailpipe to the car window. The discovery made the news, and one of my old high school friends called to remind me of that night in the woods. It was the same area, and the car we saw was likely his. Later, my coworker received a call from her mother. The man in the car was her father. We had heard him moaning. We had seen the car. If we hadn't been such scared kids, maybe we could have done something. Watching my friend fall apart over the news was heartbreaking, but I never told her about my experience in the woods. I've always carried the guilt with me. Story 11. The story of the girl who got lost in the Odessa catacombs in 2005 is haunting. I can only imagine the grim realization of being lost and alone in a seemingly endless maze of tunnels. At first, you might think it's just a matter of retracing your steps, but then the battery on your phone dies, plunging you into complete darkness. You're left feeling along the cold, damp walls as an eerie silence surrounds you, broken only by your footfalls and sobs. Your only company is your fears, regrets, and the crushing question of how you ended up in this nightmare when just hours ago you were drunkenly partying with friends. Days pass, and your cries into the void go unanswered. Hope of rescue fades. You realize no one is coming. Dehydrated, hungry, scared, and exhausted, you collapse, your body giving out long before help ever arrives. 2 years later, your remains are found, a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers of the unknown. Story 12. My Oma grew up in Wiesloch, Germany, during the Holocaust and World War II. She rarely talks about that time, but when she does, her stories are chilling. She once mentioned that friends of hers would just disappear, but they were raised not to ask questions. The most haunting story she told me happened when she was playing by the railroad tracks with her friends. A large freight train passed by, and she heard scratching and screaming. It wasn't the sound of animals. She knew that sound well. This was different. Frightened, she ran home and asked her mother what it could have been. Her mother yelled at her to never ask questions like that again, to stay away from the tracks, and to speak to no one about it. The memory of that moment lingers, a glimpse into the horrors of that time. Story 13. 5 years ago, I responded to a call for a respiratory emergency. As we left the station, dispatch updated us that the patient had gone unresponsive, urging us to expedite. When we arrived, the house was dilapidated and unsettling. The family living there was pale, dirty, and constantly moving in and out of rooms, which only added to the unease. We were eventually directed upstairs, where we found the patient half underneath a bed, completely naked and eerily reminiscent of the girl from The Ring. I tried to focus on CPR despite the overwhelming stench of cat urine and feces, the strange symbols on the walls, and the blood and filth-covered mattress. Unfortunately, she didn't survive. Afterward, we informed the family along with the police and paramedics. One family member, the daughter, was around my age and seemed particularly unsettling. She was also nearly naked, staring into the room where her mother had been, and her presence unnerved me. A few days later, I was driving my girlfriend to dinner after stopping at work to pick up my paycheck. As we approached the house, I noticed the stained mattress on the curb. My girlfriend found it creepy, but for me, it was a chilling reminder of the call. Then as we passed the house again, I saw the daughter standing on the sidewalk, staring at the mattress. When my car passed, she looked up, locking her eyes on me. The way she looked at me was terrifying. Her expression was hungry, like she somehow recognized me despite the unmarked car and the traffic around us. It's a moment that haunts me to this day. I don't know how she knew it was me, but that look will stay with me forever. Story 14. This story involves my mom and her close encounter with the infamous Scarborough rapist. When she was in her early 20s, she managed a photography studio in a mall in Scarborough, Ontario. One day, while working alone, a man walked in and asked for a photo. He was acting a bit strange and mentioned needing a picture of his hip. My mom assumed it was for a court case. They often did injury photos, so she started preparing the camera. When she looked up, the man had dropped his pants and was exposing himself. My mom, unfazed, started laughing hysterically and told him to get out, saying she didn't have time for such nonsense. About an hour later, a girl who worked at a denim store down the hall came by to share that a pervert had exposed himself to customers in her store. They laughed it off, assuming he was just mentally unstable. 2 days later, the same girl ran into my mom's studio, pale and shaken. She showed her the front page of the newspaper, which featured a sketch of the man with the headline, Scarborough Rapist. It was chilling to realize how close my mom had come to being attacked by Paul Bernardo during the peak of his crime spree. Story 15. When I was in my early teens, my parents would go out dancing on Friday nights, leaving me home alone. We lived in a quiet, rustic house, isolated except for a sawmill and a defunct car garage. Our closest neighbor was about a mile away. I'd use those nights to blast heavy metal albums on my parents' amazing stereo system. One evening, I put on Metallica's Injustice for All and headed to the restroom in a far corner of the house. As Blackened blared in the distance, the bass made it feel like the floor was shaking. When I returned to the living room, I noticed the chain on the front door was vibrating in rapid rhythms. I thought to myself, wow, the bass on this system is incredible. Then in the middle of the song, the chain abruptly stopped moving. I never figured out why, but the memory still gives me chills. Story 16. When my uncle was 4, he spent the summer at his aunt's house. Since there weren't any kids his age around, he entertained himself by riding his bike through the neighborhood. One day he ventured too far and got lost. A car pulled over and the man inside told him it was okay. He'd drive him back to his aunt's house. Trusting the stranger, my uncle loaded his bike into the car and got in. At first, my uncle thought the man was one of his aunt's friends, so he didn't question him. But when the car turned onto the highway, he became confused and started asking where they were going, telling the man that his aunt's house wasn't near the highway. The man said nothing and kept driving. Eventually, the man pulled over on the side of the road, looking deep in thought. After a few moments, he turned the car around and drove my uncle back to the entrance of the neighborhood, dropping him off before speeding away. Years later, my uncle realized what had happened. The man had likely intended to kidnap him, but changed his mind at the last moment. It's a chilling thought to imagine how differently things could have turned out. Story 17. This story is about my dad. When he was around 10 or 12, he and a friend were playing near a small river in southern Wisconsin. It was freezing cold and they noticed a capsized canoe in the water. 2 men, likely fishermen, were clinging to it for dear life, blue from the cold and barely able to speak. My dad and his friend managed to pull the men out of the water, saving their lives. It became a big deal in their town, even making it into the local paper. Fast forward about 5 years. My dad, now a teenager, was driving to a concert in Chicago with the same friend in his new car. They weren't wearing seatbelts. It was the 70s after all. And as they passed a bar, a mobile home flew out of the parking lot into the street. The driver, likely drunk, hadn't looked, and my dad crashed head-on into the trailer. The car was totaled, but not wearing seatbelts somehow saved their lives as the impact propelled them forward and upward, avoiding the crushed bottom half of the car. Shaken but unharmed, they got out of the car just as the propane tank on the trailer exploded, engulfing it in flames. 2 men stumbled out, screaming in agony, their skin blistering and bubbling. They died right there in front of a crowd that had gathered from the bar. My dad later discovered that these 2 men were the very same fishermen he and his friend had saved 5 years earlier. Life has a strange, dark sense of irony. Story 18. In my senior year of high school, I took a class on genocide. Toward the end of the course, several Holocaust survivors came to speak with us. One man's story stood out. He recounted a moment when he was rummaging through garbage in a concentration camp, searching for food, and was caught by a guard. The guard forced him to kneel, and he felt the cold barrel of a gun against his neck. Just as he thought his life was over, a thick fog rolled in, distracting the guard. Suddenly, he heard a clang and the sound of footsteps. When the fog cleared, he saw a bloody shovel on the ground and realized another prisoner had struck the guard and fled. The man said he had spent his life wishing to thank the stranger who had saved him that day. 3 speakers later, another man shared his story. He spoke about a night in the camp when he was searching for food and saw another prisoner being caught by a guard. He was terrified but saw a shovel nearby when a thick fog rolled in. Acting on instinct, he grabbed the shovel, struck the guard, and ran back to his bunk. He lamented never seeing the man he saved again. The entire room erupted as we realized that the 2 men were talking about the same event. They were brought together after nearly 70 years and immediately embraced, breaking down in tears. Amazingly, they had been living only 4 miles apart for the last 40 years. Story 19. As a funeral director, I once had a man come in who had lost his teenage daughter. She was a daddy's girl, and her death devastated him. He spared no expense for her burial, buying the best casket in a high-quality vault. But after her interment, he began having recurring nightmares. In every dream, his daughter was drowning, in a bathtub, the ocean, or a car that had plunged off a bridge. Every time he could hear her screaming, "Daddy, help me, I'm drowning." Drowning had nothing to do with her cause of death, so at first he chalked it up to grief. But the nightmares wouldn't stop. The man came back to us, desperate for answers. After hearing his story, we obtained a permit to dishonor her and move her to another cemetery. When the vault was opened, we discovered it was filled to the brim with water, despite being designed to keep water out. It was horrifying. After moving her to a different cemetery, the man's nightmares ceased. Sometimes it seems like the connection between the living and the dead goes deeper than we can understand. Story 20. When I was 18, I stayed alone at my parents' house while they went on a summer vacation. I lived in an outhouse on the property and never locked my room, thinking it was safe. On the 3rd day, I visited a local haunted house where a gruesome family murder had taken place in the 80s. My friends joked about how eerie it would be if something happened to me that night, like a cliché horror movie. I brushed it off but grabbed my little brother's baseball bat and put it by my bed just in case. That night, I went to bed as usual, pulling the curtain closed on the window that overlooked my bed. Around 3 a.m., I was suddenly overcome by the feeling that someone was watching me. The silence was deafening, and I struggled to emerge fully from sleep. Part of me tried to dismiss it as a cat or something, but then I heard the creaky front door open. I froze, eyes wide open but unable to move. I saw a man step into my room, staring at me. He took 2 slow paces toward my bed, breathing heavily, and then, after what felt like an eternity, turned around and walked out. Eventually, I crawled out of bed, grabbed the bat, and crept to the door. It was open. So was the main house. Nothing was stolen, and I have no idea what happened or why, but it remains the most terrifying experience of my life. Story 21. A 16-year-old girl was house-sitting for a family friend. Late one night, she heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It wouldn't stop, but she was too scared to investigate alone. Fear creeping in, she decided to call 911. Explaining the situation and telling them not to rush, as it was probably nothing. Within 2 minutes, several police officers arrived at the house. 4 of them went into the basement while 1 stayed with her outside. Moments later, she heard shouting, and the officers brought up a deranged-looking man. He had been sitting on the washer, banging a machete between it and the dryer, trying to lure her down. Shaken, she asked the officers how they knew someone was down there. They explained that when she had called 911 and hung up, the operator had heard a second click on the line. He had been listening. Story 22. I went 9 days without proper sleep due to a severe bout of insomnia, though I experienced microsleeps toward the end. By day 4, I began to hallucinate. Harmless things at first, like tiny 2-dimensional palm trees that would disappear when I looked at them from the wrong angle. But after a few more days, the hallucinations completely took over. I lived what felt like a parallel life. In reality, it lasted only 2 or 3 days, but in my mind, it spanned weeks. It didn't feel like a dream or a delusion. It felt completely real. To this day, I remember it as clearly as any other part of my life. When I finally crashed and slept, I woke up to find reality snapping back into place. The experience had taken a physical toll. I missed over a month of school. Initially, I couldn't function despite getting normal sleep, and eventually I became sick. The doctor suggested the insomnia had been the cause. The hardest part, though, was coming to terms with those 2 weeks that never actually happened. It wasn't that anything profound happened in the hallucination, but it was so vivid and real that I couldn't convince myself it wasn't. For a long time, I lived in fear of waking up again, unable to trust my surroundings or enjoy the good things in life. I worried the people I met or cared about might not even exist. Over time, the paranoia faded. I came to accept that no one can ever truly prove they're experiencing reality, so there's no point in doubting it. But even now, I remember those 2 weeks as clearly as any other memory. It's unsettling to think how fragile our perception of reality can be. Story 23. About 15 years ago, when I was 17 and in high school in Seattle, I hung out with friends who smoked and drank, though I didn't often join in. One night, a few of us from the soccer team went to Volunteer Park on Capitol Hill. It was a school night, but they wanted to smoke before heading home. The west side of the park had a lot of trees where you could hide and do things you didn't want to be seen doing. Everything started out normal. Giggling, smoking, and hanging out. I took one hit off the blunt, intending to keep it light since my parents were picking me up later. I told my friends I'd go keep watch for cops and climbed one of the park's large evergreen trees with low, easy-to-climb branches. From about 20 feet up, I had a great view of the Space Needle and was enjoying the night. Then I heard branches snapping below me. I looked down and saw a man standing there, staring in the direction of my friends. About 25 feet away, I saw another man. Then I noticed more figures, about 15 men in total, forming a semicircle around where my friends were. They weren't cops or security, and there was no reason for them to be there at 11 p.m. I stayed still, terrified, waiting for what felt like forever before climbing down quietly and running toward the greenhouse in the park. About 50 feet away, I saw my friends sprinting out of the woods. They told me someone had tried to grab one of them, and the girl screamed, causing them all to run. I'll never forget that night. There's no telling what those men intended, but I've heard stories about people disappearing in Seattle parks. Be careful out there. Story 24. This story stuck with me because of its quiet, haunting nature. A friend of mine lived on Long Island in 2001, around the time of September 11th. I lived in California then, and still do, and though I barely knew anyone personally who died that day, the tragedy felt almost like a movie, something happening on TV. Not in real life. Out of morbid curiosity, I asked my friend if she had any stories about that day. I suppose I was expecting tales of collapsing buildings, panic, and chaos. Something that felt dramatic and movie-like. Instead, her story was simple and profoundly affecting. She told me she didn't personally know anyone who had died and hadn't been in Manhattan on that day. But she did mention one detail. Every morning, she went to the train station very early for work, long before most people arrived. Before September 11th, the parking lot was usually empty at that hour. Afterward, there were always 6 or 7 cars that never moved. Day after day, they accumulated parking tickets and chalk marks on their tires. Eventually, the authorities figured out those cars belonged to people who had never come back for them. That image, silent cars left behind, waiting for drivers who would never return, hit me harder than any footage or dramatic story. It wasn't exciting, and there was no action or heroism, just those cars quiet and abandoned, as mute reminders of lives that had been suddenly, violently ended. In that moment, the tragedy